She joined DFID in 2003 and has since held many posts overseas, worked on policy and corporate roles in many of the parts of the world, and now her last post was with partners leading the department responsible for developing policy and programming with partners to increase the focus on open societies, transparency, and accountability. And after Judith, final speaker of the panel is Faiza Hassan, who is the executive director of the Interagency Network for Education in Emergencies and has more than 20 years of experience across education, social policy reform, and humanitarian response. She began her career as a chemical engineer and has come very far to talk to us today about INEE's work, focusing on many different parts of the education system, but obviously some of the challenges about working on education in emergencies in this current climate. So we're very, very happy for this amazing panel. I will pass over to Giorgia first. Thank you so much, Giorgia, for being here.
Thank you so much for the invitation, and congratulations to the organizers for organizing such an important event. And it's actually quite nice to be back at Cambridge when I was here last century as a student. So it's good to be back. So the way in which I'm trying to address the topic of the conference, the politics of displacement, is by kind of trying to look at the relationship between discourses, frames, and lived experiences. And I'm going to start with a kind of a contextual slide that looks at the changing landscape of forced migration. So compared to, when I was a student here, we have seen major changes in global migration movements and forced migration movements. First, we have a globalization of migration, which is going in multiple directions beyond the majority to minority world. We have many transitions, the emergence of transit countries, but also people stuck in between places, geographies, and also statuses. And we have this differentiation of statuses that is proliferating beyond that of the conventional refugee. We also see that what Caldo refers to as new wars is having an impact on displacements, because these are wars that are long-lasting. They pause and then they come back, multiple actors, economies of wars. And that means that it's in this increasing complex context, it's impossible, or it's becoming more challenging for the conventional durable solutions, settlement, resettlement, repatriation to be, put into practice. And therefore we have more and more scenarios of protracted displacements where people are stuck for longer periods in this in-between limbo status. And then we also see that across the world, we have an increased number of restrictions on the rights and access to facilities of migrants and refugees. But also we have in the last maybe 10 to 15 years, a really kind of an increase in the ways in which detentions, deportations, and now offshore processing are becoming mainstream kind of policies of governments across Europe and also outside. Recreating, one could say, colonial relationships with countries in the South who are now doing the job for the European Union, etc., etc. But also we see that the asylum and citizenship rights are being constrained. And for those of you who are in the UK, you may know now that with the last 2025 Secure Borders Asylum and Immigration Bill will take longer, between 5 to 10 years, to become citizen. And if you came through the undocumented route, the so-called boat people, you may never be entitled to become a citizen in this country. So we can see these restrictions, and they're all in the broader understanding of the politicization of migration, both in terms of the policies themselves, but also in terms of societal relationships and the media, etc., etc. So within this global context of changing patterns, we can see that there are also changing responses. So because we're in a way thinking about the 75th anniversary of the core, the pillar of refugee protection and assistance, the 51 Convention, we can see that the language of the different tools, the architecture for protection and assistance that has been implemented across the world has also changed. So if you look at the 51 Convention, you have, the Protocol on the Status of Refugees, and then you have the OAU in 69 and Cartagena in 84, enlarging and expanding that definition, reflecting local and regional realities. There are many more in between. A key point was the guiding principles on internal displacement in 1998, because they, in a way, moved protection from not only outside borders, but also inside the borders of sovereign states. And then we have the 29 Kampala Declaration on Internal Displacement. Fast forward, what we have in the last few years is a global effort to address issues of rights, migration, but also these changing global patterns of migration and enforced migration through the global compacts, which are international kind of instruments. And what is interesting is that we have the global compact on refugees, which reminds us of the 51 Convention, but then we have the global compact on migration, which focuses on orderly movements, etc., safe, orderly return and movement of people. While we know that in this changed environment, the nexus between asylum and migration, the mixed motives for people moving are much more intertwined. Therefore, this separation, so distinct, doesn't account for the gray areas in between. In the European Union in 2024, coming into effect as of this month, we have the comprehensive EU asylum policy. And what we find here is another interesting shift in language. There isn't refugee or migrant in this one, but there is migration and asylum. So there is an introduction of the term asylum as being embedded into the EU understanding of what it means to address the the rights or address the movement of people coming into the EU. It's through the asylum lens or the migration lens. And then we have the 2025 UK bill that was recently passed, where we have immigration, asylum, but we also have secure borders embedded in the national description of the policies. So the point I'm making here is that we have a changed, increasingly complex landscape of global forced migration movements. We have a changed architecture for the protection and assistance of refugees. And what I want to move now is, but what are the key frameworks, discourses that are, in a way, at a higher level, making us think scholarly about these changes? And I identify also a transition in the broader frameworks within which the assistance and protection of refugees has been kind of addressed over time. So we go from the conventional rights frameworks, of protection, the humanitarian assistance framework, to the increasing securitization of borders framework. And now one which I think we need to talk more about, which is the economic frameworks with its entrepreneurship at its kind of coming into humanitarian assistance and rights. So let me just go very briefly over these 4 frameworks, and there are more, I'm sure, but I'm just identifying a few of them. So when we think of the right framework, the understanding is that people across borders are right-bearing individuals that also have a fundamental right to seek asylum and protection, and also that protection and assistance is being provided within international law, and that the ones who provide this protection and assistance are predominantly nation states and the international community. So you can see that the legal framework is a state-centered perspective. Then if we move to the humanitarian framework, it is kind of something that the NGO organizations speak a lot about, humanitarian sectors, and it's framed on the idea of a shared humanity. And then where people are in need, they should be assisted independently of their religion, nationality, political opinion. Yeah. So there is this kind of assumption behind the humanitarian framework. But then it's being kind of criticized because it can reproduce, in a way, certain racialized codes of the non-threatening victim, who tends to be a child or a woman. So the feminization of vulnerability and its racialization of people. And somebody was talking about the North and the South, yeah? That humanitarian assistance operates across the global South. And then others are criticized in terms of risking of creating powerless and voiceless kind of victims as a whole. What we have is then in recent years, the emergence of the security framework. So if we look at the, people who are rights-bearing individuals, maybe victims, etc., who want asylum in Europe, are being portrayed and described as illegalized, criminalized, terrorist threat, invader, a threat to social cohesion, within this broader, much framework that is becoming very, very strong, the securitization framework, the criminalization framework of migration, the masculinization understanding of the threat of the brown, Muslim, other men, etc., and is kind of shaping exclusionary policies around belonging and non-belonging. And the one that I think is emerging and becoming more and more central is the economic framework. So we have to the left a book that I discovered as I was preparing for this presentation. And the title speaks broadly, The Refugee Market. And then I had some other readings, which, and one of them by the World Bank Group talks about all these private initiatives that they can do in the refugee sectors. And then Wanji talks about we should move from aid to entrepreneurship. And this kind of is a continuation of the self-reliance of refugees that, in the humanitarian and development sector we've spoken about for many years, but it has a new connotation, which is about focusing on a particular element of refugees or, displaced people being, let's say, contributors to the economy or competitors sometimes to others, but also then a burden if they can't find a job. So it's something that in a book we wrote in the last chapter, we said it's kind of an ambivalent kind of positionality. So having described this framework, among many others, probably, I don't know which ones, but these emerging frameworks, my interest is what about taking a refugee center perspective? What about thinking, how do people who are displaced, people who move, people who become students in universities or go to school across the displacement trajectories, how are they positioned in relation to these frameworks? What happens to them? And I want to give an example from a project that we have been involved in. So I work at the University of East London, which has a long history of kind of promoting education, higher education for migrants, refugees, and working class students. So we have a long history of inclusion, open access programs, widening participation programs. So when the crisis, so-called European crisis in 2015 happened, a group of us went through a civic engagement project funded by the university. We went to Calais. And we initiated a series of workshops using different forms of art and creative, literature, etc., because we wanted to make a point that people who are crossing border, they're not necessarily victims, they're not illegal, they're learners. They can be learners on the route. After that, we had another project at the University of East London in partnership with the European consortium called OLIVE, Open Learning Initiatives, where we support migrants, refugees, and undocumented people to access university through a whole range of activities. And then as part of that, we worked with internationally with an educational NGO and their student ambassadors to support their provision of advice and guidance for refugees and displaced people from the Middle East wanting to access universities abroad. And as part of that, we did a kind of co-creation through teaching research methods to the student ambassadors who had a post-migration background. And then they were talking to other people, and then they were creating these narratives and stories and putting them on a website so that others could learn lessons. So I'm saying this because the next example I'm giving you of this refugee center approach is a short testimonial from one of the kind of co-production of a narrative. Now it's an excerpt, so it's quite short, but what I find interesting, and for me it raises question, is how does this very brief story connect to this other frameworks? So, and I'm going to read it to you. Yeah, so I'm Taki al-Musawi from Iraq. I lived in Lebanon for several years, and during my presence there, you volunteer for a number of institutions. Volunteer added a lot of positive things to me. The skills increased my confidence, and etc. Volunteerism helped me identify many wonderful people through whom I met a Canadian institution called the University of Service. university world that was interested in students in Lebanon and Jordan. And from there, I got their student scholarship, which gave me the opportunity to travel to Canada to study there. I believe that a large part of my acceptance of the grant is my volunteering work, because it is important in Western countries. And I always believe that a simple act of kindness creates an endless ripple. So if we take this quote as an example, we can look maybe at the broader kind of story and say that, there are kind of discourses, that are lived experiences, that there is a paradox between the figure of the refugee and the complexity of the lived experiences that are being shaped. But what is interesting for me is that if we take a refugee-centered approach, we can say probably there is kind of an interaction there, a relationship between right framework, right to education, maybe I'm not sure about victim framework, definitely not seeing himself as a victim, so in relation, but a counter-positionality to that. And definitely, maybe, I don't know about the securitization, we didn't have information, but it's interesting because it's not necessarily the economic framework that emerges, but it's the volunteering framework. And I'm saying that because the Home Office in last year, February 2025, introduced a new guideline for refugees that is predicated on good behavior. So if you volunteer, you behave well in this country, and then you gain points, and then you can apply for citizenship. So you can see how now this volunteering for him is connected to access to universities. For the Home Office is connected to access to citizenship. So the connection between the lived experiences and the policies are important here. So I want to come towards the kind of the end of my presentation by giving another example of this kind of interaction between the lived experience and the policies, the discourses, and the practices. So as I said, we have had all these different programs taking place for more than a decade in different contexts, inside universities, at the margins of the universities, outside the universities, by the same group of people with, similar kind of, I suppose, values. And as part of that, we have reflected on those programs, and we identified education, not only in this marketized world as a tool to getting jobs, but as a way, in Freire's kind of understanding, as a way to raise awareness and to think collectively and together. So our kind of effort is part of this kind of radically open, anti-racist, decolonial, pluri-university that a number of scholars are now kind of talking more and more about, which are in dialogue. I'm not sure what type of dialogue with neoliberal universities. But as part of that program, we developed like a model where we try to integrate, and it's called OMNI, which stands for Open, Multimodal, Narratively Based, and Inclusive. So our model, our understanding of education for migrants and refugees in higher education as well, focused on higher education, is that it should be open and free to all, regardless not only of education background, but also of citizenship and status background. So when students come to our programs as learners, whether it's in Calais or whether it's at UEL or whether it's somewhere else, we don't ask for identity cards. We don't ask for language tests. It's multimodal because it adopts different modalities of learning that counteract the colonial language of English. So students can write their assignments in any language they want to, and then maybe we can use a tool to translate it. It's also narratively based because we start from a person-centered, narrative-based center, where it is the experience of the learner who is a refugee that is at the center of this space. And the narratives can be oral written, but also embodied through theater. Again, challenging the predominance of, the English, the essay writing, and the dissertation. And then it's inclusive, not only in terms of inclusion at the entry point, but also inclusive in creating spaces where we can have these conversations with people who have had experiences of displacement and refugees. And we have conversations about the hostile environment. We have conversations about universities. So our attempt with our project is not only to support migrants and refugees to have skills to enter university, we also want to create a space for reflection And we also want to challenge the university as a bordering institution, which is also connected to the hostile environment in the UK. And we all know, you don't have it here, but we have, our scan cards where if your students don't come, so we become border guards. So that really is kind of our attempt at collecting experiences and policies and practices and structures. And I'm going to conclude with a quote from one of our students, learners, where he describes Olive. So he says, Olive is always going to be the one that instigated my love of education, which I thought was already dead. I can see that it will stay with me for a long, long time. Olive gave me the kick in the back, basically. Whatever opportunity is given to you, just take it and think later. But then this is the key one. Before Olive, I didn't realize that I was able to speak out and speak up and speak against the wrong things that this government has done or other governments are doing, that I could really express myself for the benefit of other people and also to speak the truth. And this is how I want to conclude. So in response to the call of the paper, I hope I've shown you that when we look at this complex relationship, we can see that it does exist through different frames. When we talk about the role of education as a pillar of humanitarianism, we can also see how education can really be a pillar for rethinking societies and the world we live in. And when, and it cannot be, in a way, agreeing with the call, it cannot be separated from the broader questions we have. So I have the references for those who want, and thank you.
Thank you so, so much. We're now going to switch the microphone so that Judith can also use it and she can stand at her first place at the lectern. And we'll try to make this a smooth transition as possible. Thank you, Giorgia, for giving us not only the bigger global picture, but also the lived experiences and the example of how it can be also encountered. We are now then maybe to Judith, if you are ready.
Nearly. Good morning, everybody. I'm hoping those of you can hear me online. I'm sorry you can't see me, but you're not missing anything, but apologies. I would also like to apologise for my CV. I'm not quite sure where that came from. It seemed to give a very curious picture that even I didn't recognise of what I've been doing, so forgive me for that. I'm not a professor, I'm not an academic, I'm not a refugee, I'm a civil servant. I don't set government policy, but I do deliver it. I am the head of girls' education at the Foreign Commonwealth and Development Office, which was formed from the merger of the Legacy Foreign Office and the Legacy Department for International Development. So please feel free to challenge. It's part of my job to listen and help bridge the gap between academia, activism, taxpayers and government. And although I'm not a refugee, I've worked very closely with those displaced by conflict, climate and politics in Ethiopia, Sudan, Afghanistan, Pakistan and Bangladesh. And the two facts remained with me that refugees would tell me is, number one, education is the one thing we are able to take with us when we emerge from humanitarian crises or protracted crises. And secondly, please see us as assets, not as victims. None of us knows if we're going to become refugees. Things can turn on a pinhead, as so many of you will know. But as civil servants, we have to balance the big policy, geopolitical and practical implementation challenges and respect the various organs of the government that drive and deliver different parts of the government of the day's agenda. And that can be a tricky balancing act. We also try, through our advice, to maintain an ethical, values-driven approach to how we engage, invest, and work in partnership, both domestically and internationally. And we've heard this morning what a challenge this is. Displaced persons, migrants, and refugees, not a homogenous group in terms of rights or expectations. But returning to the question on justice or politics of exclusion, the answer is both. And the difference is made, I would say, not in policy, but in allocation decisions. Frameworks like the Global Compact on Refugees have shifted norms and architecture in ways that matter, especially for education. But the politics of exclusion is reproduced downstream from the frameworks in who receives funding, which situations get protection innovations, and which regions are required, to absorb displacement on other people's behalf, and on the social and financial injustices inherent in those requests or imbalance of power dynamics. So the task is not to abandon frameworks, but to hold them to their own founding promise of predictable, equitable burden and responsibility sharing, and to ensure that the misalignment between normative aspirations, codes, doctrines, the mechanisms of nation states, whether we agree with them or not, and responsibility sharing does not curtail refugees' abilities to activate their rights to education, to work, and to participate in society, wherever they may have come from and wherever they may find themselves. So we need to reframe the argument a little bit. It's not a binary question. Frameworks are not self-executing instruments of either justice or exclusion. They're arenas in which the politics of exclusion are either confronted or perhaps laundered. And the GCR Compact's own founding premise concedes the justice problem. It exists because responsibility sharing was neither predictable nor equitable. And it was only affirmed, we know, by the General Assembly in 2018. And its central promise, therefore, was more equitable responsibility sharing, recognising that sustainable solutions cannot be achieved without international cooperation, much of what we've heard about this morning. And the view from both the country level need and global financing architecture is therefore instructive. The framework language is increasingly right. The money and the protection space still follow the geopolitics and the asymmetric power dynamics. And the structural facts that the frameworks need to answer are multiple and varied. The number of forced displacement has roughly doubled in a decade to over 120 million people. Meanwhile, as we all know, humanitarian resources have stayed broadly flat, and education financing globally continues to go down significantly. Education's slow. Education is not life-saving in humanitarian spaces, and it's always other people's children. The geography of hosting, however, is the inverse of the geography of wealth. So lower middle-income countries host around 70 to 73% of the world's refugees. They are not here in the UK. And this is only down from 89% because of Ukraine. 2/3 of refugees remain in neighbouring countries, wherever their starting point. Think Afghans in Pakistan, Rohingya in Bangladesh. Most displaced people never cross a border at all. So global frameworks are in practice negotiated largely by states that host few refugees, about obligations largely discharged by states that host many. That asymmetry is the original politics of exclusion, and the GCR was designed to correct it. And frameworks can deliver from the angle of inclusion. So viewed as a test case, education is one area where the GCR has arguably travelled furthest from rhetoric to system change. There's been a norm shift. The default model has moved from parallel camp-based schooling to inclusion in national education systems, and that has happened quite quickly. Not necessarily in countries that have great systems or that have enough public finance actually to absorb these transitioning populations, but they have done it all the same. And it's visibly and practically embedded in the GCR, in UNHCR's Refugee Education Strategy and the UN Common Pledge. So there's no lack of ambition. And again, in the 2023 Global Refugee Forum, which some of you may have been at, multi-stakeholder pledges made by the World Bank, the UK, Germany, Canada, Denmark, the Global Partnership for Education, Education Cannot Wait, Google them if you don't know them, and UNICEF committed to moving away from parallel, expensive humanitarian education to inclusion in host government education systems. And the benefits there for reducing tension between host communities and refugee populations, displaced populations, and also for accreditation for perhaps language acquisition learning, which will enable higher levels of access to education are significant. And by 2019, 60% of the UN cooperation frameworks in hosting countries already referenced specifically refugees in their results framework. And that matters, because if you measure something, it leads to policy decisions that include funding, because you can't ignore it if the language is there. So there's been an architecture shift. That humanitarian development convergence is real, particularly through one of the programs that came out of the Global Refugee Forum, the Inclusion Support Programme for Refugee Education, which is delivered through World Bank windows, whatever you think of the World Bank, through Global Partnership for Education instruments and Education Cannot Wait multi-year financing. It has brought people together, and that is something that the Compact has been responsible for, pulling development finance into displacement responses to facilitate more equitable allocation of policies. In terms of affordability and sustainability, however, the World Bank UNHCR costing puts full inclusion of refugees in national education systems at around $9.3 billion a year across low and lower middle income hosts, but only $309 million a year for low income countries. And closing that gap where it's most acute is not a question of global capacity. The constraint is political will, not money. There are also three forms of differential evidence that the frameworks can reproduce exclusion. Differential funding by region and situation. So refugee response plans are the worst funded category of humanitarian appeal. The most underfunded contexts are overwhelmingly African. UNHCR received only 32% of its global budget in 2023. Now that's a fact. It feels abstract, but translate that down to the individual children on the ground, or the women, or the men, anybody else who's in that situation, that is a devastating reduction in funding. Underfunding falls hardest inevitably on the poorer countries hosting 90% of displaced and stateless people. And earmarking that we as donors often choose to do simply compounds this. So we as donors choose the crises that we're going to support sometimes. We know it. And chronically, we tend to choose the same ones. There are the sort of orphans and darlings, which you'll have heard about. People we preference, people we ignore. Geopolitics, national interest. And that gets very difficult. I'm a diplomat and it's being recorded. There's also a differentiation protection by population. So Ukraine is the natural experiment. The EU's temporary protection directive was activated within days, granting residence, work, education and housing rights without individual asylum procedures. The flash appeal was among the fastest and best funded in history. Yet in the same season, Yemen's conference raised under a third of requirements. The lesson is not that the Ukrainians received too much, it's that the response proved what is possible when political will exists and revealed that its absence elsewhere is a choice, not a constraint. And I'm not unpacking all of that for you, you know what I'm saying. And then there's the differential design within frameworks themselves. So the GCR commitments are voluntary and ad hoc, when policy frameworks are expected to be consistently applied. Pledges concentrate where donor interest already lies. Inclusion without financing simply transfers the costs of global solidarity onto the budgets of Uganda, Chad, Colombia, and Pakistan as examples. So a few suggestions for how the frameworks could deliver a better, more practical justice agenda. We need to consider financial inclusion as a system, not a project. So predictable multi-year unearmarked financing tied to inclusion policy commitments. We need needs-blind allocation benchmarks, publishing and tracking funding per displaced person across situations. We need to make the Ukraine a flaw, not an exception. We need to shift decision power towards hosting regions and displaced people themselves. So regional support platforms, refugee-led organisations, host government leaders. And we need to protect the gains now under threat. So 2025 funding cuts that we all know about put around 11.6 million displaced people at risk of losing assistance, with refugee and host community schools already closing. So the first casualty of retrenchment is precisely that inclusion agenda. I'm happy to talk about what FCDO does, what UK does, but only if you're interested, so ask me the question if you want to know more. But in closing, frameworks don't deliver justice, allocations do. The implementation of frameworks do. We've proven in Uganda's classrooms, in Chad's schools, in Europe's response to Ukraine, that inclusion can work and that speed and generosity are possible. The question is no longer whether the frameworks can deliver, but whether we will stop deciding whose displacement deserves them. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that clarity and also helping us to understand some of these processes from maybe a different view than we often are able to invite into the conversation. We are now moving to Faiza. You want to use this microphone? Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you very much. So like Judith, I am not an academic, I'm a practitioner, and a lot of my presentation is really focused on the education in emergencies field. So when I refer to framework, standards, it's very much within the universe of education in emergencies and the wider humanitarian response. So let's start. Let's see if I can... Maybe, yes, it's working. So first I'll start by saying thank you for bringing us together to have this important discussion. And I think this is a difficult question on can global policy frameworks deliver justice or do they reproduce the politics of exclusion? And like Judith, my answer is they can do both. Because starting with frameworks matter, firstly, they give us shared language, they set standards, they help us coordinate across countries, across organizations, across crises. And in education in emergencies, frameworks like the INEE minimum standards have been essential in helping the sector define what safe, relevant, inclusive education should look like in a crisis setting. They've helped practitioners across many different contexts to speak a common language. They've helped us to support advocacy. They've helped us make the case that education is not optional in humanitarian response, but that it's central to protection, dignity, and recovery. And I say this as someone who's lived and worked in Somalia, as someone who was there when the civil war ended, and we were trying to rebuild an education system from scratch. Frameworks and standards were useful. They were a useful reference point for us, but they were only useful when we took them, made them our own, and aligned them with our lived reality and our context. And I think what the problem happens when frameworks meet the real world that we live in. The world we live in is very unequal in power. That's the fact of life. And if we do not confront power directly, then the frameworks can become tools to manage injustice more efficiently, especially within the humanitarian sector. No, is that the way? Nope. Sorry, I always have issues with technology. And so within education in emergencies, we have very strong language on the right to education. We have commitments to inclusion. We have humanitarian principles. We have minimum standards. We have, compacts, policy commitments, and they're all important. But their existence does not mean the existence of justice. And so the real questions we should ask as humanitarians is what happens to the displaced child who cannot enroll because they lack documentation? What happens to the refugee teacher who doesn't get paid, is not recognized, and is not remunerated adequately? And we, as international, as part of the international system, don't pay them, but are happy to use their labor for free. What happens to young people who complete years of education but cannot progress because their learning is not recognized? And so the questions we should be asking is, what kind of power do these global frameworks carry within education in emergencies? Who do they serve? Do they redistribute power? Or do they just manage inequality a bit more efficiently? Do they create the space for displaced communities to define their own futures? Or do we use the frameworks to invite communities to participate in systems where the real decisions have already been made and already been set? And so when we talk about what does justice mean in education in emergency settings, I think as humanitarians, we tend to focus on access and quality of learning. But then justice is not just sitting in a classroom. Justice is also to have the right to shape the education that is being offered to you as a refugee. It is the right to learn in a language that makes sense to you. It is the right to have your history, identity, and future recognized. And so justice is about recognition. It's also about redistribution. Are the resources really reaching the people that are closest to the crisis? Or are the resources recycling through mainly international intermediaries? And then justice is also about representation. Who defines the problem? Who decides what success looks like? And who gets to speak on behalf of displaced communities? And then I think also justice should be about accountability within our sector. Like, to whom are we accountable? Are we accountable, of course, to our donors and to boards, to coordination structures? Or are we truly accountable to the children, the families, the teachers that are directly affected by the crises that we're supposed to be responding to? And so once we start to define justice in this broader sense, we can see then in the education and emergency sector how our existing frameworks are falling short. And how they can risk reproduce exclusion in very polished language. Because there's many ways in which our existing frameworks reproduce exclusion, but I'll just list 3 of them. The first one is we tend to universalize without listening. And yes, frameworks within the humanitarian sector and education and emergency sector are designed to travel across context. That is part of their purpose. But then displacement is not experienced in the same way. And the realities facing Palestinians compared to the realities facing Somalis or Afghans are very different. And so these struggles are not interchangeable. And so a framework may use universal language, but the people living within specific histories of violence, dispossession, and exclusion are different. I think when our frameworks become very abstract, they tend to flatten these realities, and then we tend to make the issue look like a technical problem rather than a deeply political condition. I think the second risk is participation, and when that becomes consultation. In the humanitarian sector, we love the language of participation. We always say, communities were consulted, young people were engaged, teachers were included. But consultation is not the same as power. And participation is also not the same as power. And very often, communities are invited to speak after the agenda has already been set. They're asked to validate priorities that they didn't choose. And they're asked to share lived experience, but they don't control the resources. And then, they're invited into panels, but not into decision-making structures. And I can tell you about the number of places I would get invited to as a local staff living in Somalia. And I think by the end of my time in Somalia, I'd reached the point where I stopped engaging because I was like, nah, I'm not interested. I'm not interested to join a room or a panel if you've already decided on your priorities. So what do you need me for? You just want us to validate and approve what you've already decided. I think the third risk is when frameworks tend, I've said this before, frameworks tend to reduce justice to implementation. Like, we are good at identifying gaps in the humanitarian sector, not enough schools, not enough teachers, not enough data, not enough coordination structures, not enough funding. And these are real problems, but they're not technical problems. They're very much also political choices. Because when a displaced child is excluded from a national education system, is not an implementation problem, it's a political choice. When a refugee teacher is not paid for their labor, that is not a technical problem, that's a political choice. When local organizations are expected to deliver the work, but are not trusted with flexible funding by donors, again, that's very much a political choice about trust and control. And I think the danger that we can have with humanitarian frameworks is that we can make injustice look like a technical failure rather than very deliberate political decisions and choices. And so, yeah, I think for education in emergencies, this is, I'm just going to skip through some of this. For education in emergencies, I think we really need to ask questions around the frameworks that we have. Do they remove barriers to recognition, progression, and dignity? Do they shift resources to those closest to crisis? Do they support teachers? Do they make national systems more inclusive? Do they also challenge the political conditions that produce these injustices? If the answer is yes, then yeah, our frameworks can become instruments of justice. But if the answer is no, then our framework, like I said, makes injustice look like a technical failure. And then in the next slide, just a couple of thoughts of, okay, how do we make our existing frameworks within the sector more justice-oriented? Because like I said in the beginning, frameworks are useful when they're used depending on the people who use them and how they're used. And so I think 4 shifts. One is to move from compliance to accountability. So standards and frameworks should not be only tools for agencies to use, but they should also be tools for communities to use and demand quality, safe, and inclusive education. And like I said, my experience in Somalia was when we took those frameworks and made them our own, that's when they were the most useful to us. And so the INEE minimum standards, for example, is most powerful when it's not a checklist owned by an international organization, but when it's a shared public good where communities, teachers, and ministries of education can ask, is education here safe? Is it relevant? Is it inclusive? Who's being left out? And then the second piece is we need to move away from consultation to shared governance. We need to stop confusing voice with power. It is not enough to ask displaced communities what they think. It is, I mean, we need to be very clear that the people experiencing displacement should be the ones who define the vision, and they should also be the ones who define what success looks like. And then a third point on financing, where I completely agree with Judith, we need to move away from project financing into ecosystem financing, because short-term projects will not deliver justice for communities living through long-term displacement. And so we need to finance the informal system that keeps education and learning going in these communities. I think on financing, it also means that we need to change how we understand risk, because I think too often funders do not focus on the risk of heavy compliance requirements, fragmented projects, and decision made far from the context compared to the other hesitations that we might have. And then the fourth is to move from evidence extraction to knowledge justice. And I think this is also where maybe sometimes universities and academics can become complicit, because in our sector, people are interviewed, they're surveyed, they're assessed, they're consulted, but they don't always control the questions being asked. They don't always shape the interpretation of the data. They don't always decide what knowledge is used and how it's used. And so that has to change. Like, lived experience is not anecdotal, and local research is not secondary. And I think practitioner knowledge is not informal simply because it wasn't produced in the usual institutions of global authority. And I think if frameworks are to deliver justice, then we also have to recognize different forms of knowledge and create space for crisis-affected communities to shape the evidence base, not only contribute to it. Yeah. And on the final slide is the role of INEE, global networks, and humanitarian responders. I think INEE for the last 25 years has been a reference point for the education in emergency sector, providing frameworks, guidelines, technical resources. And I think also we need to be really honest about how some of this is complicit in keeping some of these structures in place. And the role that a network like INEE and others play cannot be only to produce standards and convene actors and support technical alignments. It has to be actively questioning how can we as a global network shift power rather than centralize it. And we also have to be honest about the limits of the system within which we work. And we have to be honest that global networks can open spaces, but they can also reproduce hierarchy. We can amplify local voices, but we can also filter them. And so changing things has to be really intentional. It won't be accidental. And we have to ask honest questions about who benefits from our convening power, who's missing, whose priorities are shaping the agenda. Are we making it easier for local actors to lead, or are we simply asking them to fit into systems that weren't designed for them? And I'll close by saying, I agree with Judith that frameworks in and of themselves do not deliver justice. They only deliver justice when we can name inequality, when we are honest about the political decisions that are leading to the world that we live in. And so the challenge ahead of us is not to abandon global frameworks, but to make them answerable to the people whose lives they claim to serve. So I'll end it there.
Thank you so much. Thank you for all three speakers. It's so amazing, and I'm deeply honored to have this representative from so different spheres speaking together, and to very much also speaking the same language and thinking about everything from Giorgia, your very global frameworks, and how we also see how we can negotiate it within an institution like the university, to the kind of decisions that the state and has to make, as well as the ways in which they can be implemented in and also negotiated, as you are talking about, Faiza. So thank you so much for these really, really amazing and rich presentations.